Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of History Quest. I'm your host, Brian Haynes, and as always, I've got some great stories to share with you today. I'd like to take a moment, first of all, to thank everybody who came out to our big Christmas gathering at the museum back in early December. The place was packed. Probably a good thing the fire marshal wasn't there, but it was great. It was one of the best events we've had in recent memory. It raised a good chunk of money, and it was just great to see so many new and so many familiar places into the museum. It went so well that we're thinking about doing another one this spring, and for sure another one next year at Christmas. But we had live music. We had like 3 different troops of live music. We had snacks, and Santa was there. It was just a great night. So again, everybody who came out to that, thank you so much, and look forward to one coming up again here this spring. Just a few other things. One thing I wanted to address was the newsletter we've been sending out, or the magazine, I should say. It's more of a magazine now than a newsletter. But those who have been getting it through the mail, the physical mail, have been waiting some really long wait times in order to get it. And we've looked into it as much as we can, and it's just delays at the post office is making these things go out really slow. So if you want to get them a little sooner, you can sign up for the electronic version where it gets sent to your email, because those people are getting theirs right away, of course. Otherwise, just wait this out until the postal service is kind of catching up a little bit again. But so I did want to address that. Starting in the new year, we will have a Breakfast Club meeting again on the 3rd Monday in February at 10:30. We haven't picked up a topic quite yet, but we will have one for you by then. And other than that, just sit back, enjoy these stories, and we'll see you in a bit. Thank you. So our first story today takes place in 1917 in Glencoe, Minnesota, where 2 young men were aboard a train and got into a shootout with a group of bandits who snuck on the train and attempted to mug them. Not necessarily a happy ending, a little bit of a sad ending, unfortunately, but nonetheless a great story about some of the wilder days in McLeod County. Glencoe, Minnesota, 1917. It was a Friday night in September, back in 1917. As a matter of fact, it was Friday the 13th, a day known for bad fortune. 2 young men from Lakeville, Alfred Mose and Clayton Dunham, had left home and were headed west to hunt prairie chickens. Mose was 21 and Dunham was 19. With their suitcases packed and their shotguns forwarded to their destination, the 2 young men hopped a freight train and began their journey. The freight car that the 2 young men found was filled with milling machinery that was destined for Japan. They squeezed themselves in, made themselves as comfortable as possible, and tried to get some rest. The train stopped in Glencoe to allow an eastbound passenger train to pass by. While there, a group of men peeped into the freight car in which Mose and Dunham were stowing away. When the train began moving again, the 4 men quietly hopped into the freight car. Though it was dark, Alfred Mose caught sight of them. Seeing their dark silhouettes as they snuck into the car, Mose called out, "It's pretty dark and chilly in here." But he received no reply from the 4 strangers. A moment after Mose called out, one of the strangers pulled a revolver and pointed it at Alfred while another covered Dunham. A 3rd man turned on a flashlight and shined it in Mose's face, then proceeded to tell him, "Stick 'em up." The bandits were in for a surprise. Alfred Mose fancied himself as a bit of a quick draw and reached for his own gun. He fired it and hit one of the bandits at point-blank range. The bandits fired back but did not hit Alfred, who immediately returned fire into the darkness. Alfred's gun was an 11-shot 32 caliber automatic pistol. He expended 9 of his 11 shots. Then, as the bandits began closing in on him, he used the butt of his pistol and struck one of the men. The gun fell from Alfred's hand. He then began swinging his fists in a wild fury, hoping to land a shocking blow into the bandit closest to him. Unfortunately, Alfred was overpowered. The bandits demanded Alfred hand over his money, which he did, and gave them $20. One of the men lifted Alfred onto his shoulder and intended to throw him out of the moving freight car. Luckily, Mose was able to escape. He ran to the side of the car and jumped out. Alfred was hurt, and he was sure that his pal Dunham had been struck by a bullet during the scuffle. He made his way to the farm of August Schutz. There, he was able to phone McLeod County Sheriff Klaus. The sheriff, along with a doctor, came to the home and dressed the wounds. Klaus then sent out word for a search party to look up and down the tracks for Dunham, as well as contacted the stations along the tracks to be on the lookout for bandits. Dunham was eventually found, but unfortunately he had been killed. The bandits were part of the notorious IWW gang from Minneapolis. One of them, Chaz Brown, was killed in the scuffle, but the other three, Charles Ekman, James Lawrence, and Clyde Jones, were for the moment on the run. Luckily, at a stop in Sumter, the section foreman, a Sumter man named Bueller, apprehended the three bandits who gave up without a scuffle. The three men were brought to Minneapolis where they were tried and sentenced for murder. It was indeed a crazy Friday the 13th. So this next story is one of my favorites. This happened in October in 1925, and there was a local Hutchinson man who was murdered near his farm, and the body was found like weeks later. And it ended up being like almost a decade-long mystery about what had happened to this gentleman. And it has a little bit of a twist ending, but it's definitely one of the best stories I've come across, so sit back and enjoy. It was October 30th, 1925. George Hopkins was the first to see it. It was a ghastly sight, sickening and horrifying. In a ditch, about 60 feet from the road and covered with leaves and snow, was a lifeless body. It was visible only from the feet that protruded from the debris. Hopkins knew at once that it must be the body of Frank Micka, a Hutchinson man who was missing. On the evening prior, a search party was out looking for signs of Micka. They came close to the Hopkins property but ended their search. The following day, George took it upon himself to resume the search, and that's what led him to such a gruesome sight. Frank Micka had been missing for several days. On October 12th, he informed his daughter, Genevieve Micka, that he was heading to his farm on Bear Lake, where he split his time between there and his home in Hutchinson. Once at the farm, he planned to aid Albert Tupa, a resident of the farm, in building a structure for the hogs. He explained to Genevieve that he would stay at the farm until the job was completed, 2, maybe 3 weeks at the most. Frank arrived at the farm on October 13th and began working. He first helped to work on the structure, aiding the carpenters who were hired for the job. In the afternoon, he decided to go out in the field and husk corn with the hired man. That afternoon, as the carpenters returned to town, Micka reportedly left the farm and was headed back to Hutchinson. It was the last time he was seen alive. Days passed without anyone realizing Frank was missing. Back home in Hutchinson, his daughter didn't worry about his absence, as they presumed he would be away for a week or two. On the farm, as well, it was assumed that he had simply gone back to town and stayed there. It wasn't until Frank's nephew, Joseph Micka, who lived near the farm and with whom Frank regularly stayed while working on the farm, began to wonder why his uncle had not been to the farm lately. Joseph decided to head into Hutchinson to see Frank. Yet when he arrived at the Micka home, he found that Frank wasn't there. Joseph questioned Genevieve, who explained that Frank was at the farm. Both became alarmed, however, when Joseph clarified that Frank hadn't been to his place in over 2 weeks. The disappearance prompted a search for Frank Micka. Search parties formed and hit the countryside, 200 men in total. Among the search parties were members of the Minnesota's National Guard Company G, the Hutchinson Fire Department, local law enforcement, and several citizens from Hutchinson as well as farmers in the area. They combed the countryside between Hutch and Bear Lake, but found little sign of Frank Micka, save for his hat along the road near George Hopkins' farm. On October 30th, when George Hopkins found Micka, he noted that he had suffered a gunshot wound to the back of the head, indicating that there was some foul play. This was verified by the coroner. In addition, Frank's wallet and watch were missing. A sense of dread fell over the community. Micka was a well-respected man who was taken too soon. In the weeks to come, and while the community mourned, a new search would take place, this time for the killer, who remained at large. 2 weeks had passed since the murder of Frank Micka. It was a cowardly murder. Micka had been killed by a gunshot wound to the back of his head and his possessions stolen. Residents in and around Hutchinson hoped authorities would uncover the killer within days of the murder. Yet after 2 weeks had passed, no arrests were made, and authorities still searched for clues. As would be expected, rumors began to swirl over what happened to Frank. Stories of false confessions and arrests spread like wildfire. One person was looked at closely, John Johnson, who was employed on the Micka farm by Albert Tupa. Johnson had recently been convicted and jailed for bootlegging and transporting liquor. Johnson was arrested shortly after the murder, yet at the time there was no indication that he had anything to do with it. That, of course, did not stop people from drawing their own conclusions, and many looked at Johnson with suspicion. By December of 1925, authorities and the Micka family were becoming desperate for answers. The McLeod County Commissioners held a vote on whether to offer a reward for information leading to the killers. The amount would be matched by the state. A sum of $500 reward money was voted on, but was stricken down and did not pass. As a result, the Micka family decided to offer their own reward of $1,000 for information on the case. The reward yielded no results, however, and it would be 9 years before any answers came at all. In September of 1934, another crime was committed north of Hutchinson, and it was eerily like the case of Frank Micka. This time, the victim was a man named Edward Anfinson, who was found unconscious after being bludgeoned in the back of the head with a lead pipe and robbed of his wallet. That same night, Anfinson had been out drinking with a man named Thomas Noga, a farmhand on the Pierce farm north of Hutchinson. Unbeknown to Anfinson, Noga was an ex-convict who had recently been released from Stillwater Prison. Anfinson had bragged to Noga about how much money he was carrying. So when Noga had the chance, he attacked Anfinson and took his wallet. Noga then proceeded to the Pierce farm where he met with a familiar face from the Micka murder, John Johnson. Johnson worked with Noga at the Pierce farm. And when Noga turned up at the farm after attacking Anfinson, Johnson aided him in fleeing to St. Cloud. Luckily, the pair were pulled over by law enforcement and brought to the McLeod County Jail, where Noga confessed to attacking and robbing Anfinson. Though Johnson took no part in the initial crime, he was considered an accessory and held at $5,000 bail. Police would then question Johnson, who confessed to the Micka murder, but made a startling assertion that he didn't act alone, and there was another person who assisted, a person who few believed played any part in the Frank Micka murder. Johnson and his accomplice knew Frank Micka well. Micka was a well-respected businessman and always carried a lot of cash. A plan was hatched to murder Frank Micka, steal his possessions, and then hide the evidence. They believed the plan was foolproof and that no one would ever catch on to who the killers actually were. After all, who would expect the two men employed by Micka, especially since one of them was Albert Tupa? You might remember Albert Tupa as the man who lived and worked on the Micka farm north of Hutchinson. Authorities immediately arrested Tupa and brought him to the McLeod County Jail. There, Tupa confessed to his part in the crime. His story matched that of John Johnson. Both men admitted that the murder was deliberately planned. On October 13th, The three men worked together in a cornfield. Tupa went home at 6 p.m., but Johnson remained hidden in the cornfield. When Micah left the cornfield at dusk, Johnson snuck up behind him and shot him with a double-barreled shotgun. Earlier that day, a crew of carpenters were on the farm erecting a hog shed. Tupa and Johnson assumed Micah would have a large sum of cash in his wallet to pay the carpenters. Johnson later confessed that he was disgusted to only find $15 in Frank Micah's wallet. Johnson then headed back to Tupa and reported what had happened. The two headed out to the scene of the crime to clean up. They first loaded Frank Micah's body into a car and drove to Lake Hook, where they threw the body in a ditch and did their best to cover it with brush. They then returned to the crime scene with a large quantity of kerosene. They poured the fuel on the ground over the bloodstains and set fire to it. They then took a plow and turned over the earth in that spot to obliterate any evidence that was left there. Both men were facing life in prison for the deed. On October 4th, 1934, Tupa attempted suicide by hanging himself in his cell and nearly succeeded, if not for the gurgling sound that alerted his jailers. While Tupa awaited his trial, Johnson was given a life sentence. The trial of Elper Tupa was slated for November of 1934. Though he initially confessed to the crime, Tupa entered a plea of not guilty. Johnson was one of the first to testify in the case. He recounted the plan he and Tupa concocted and the actions that followed. The two men who later arrested Tupa also testified, recounting the confession that he gave on the way to the county jail. Tupa entered the stand and claimed that he didn't remember making any confession at all, and that he was severely ill the day he was arrested. He went so far to say that Sheriff Byhofer drugged him with white pills. Though he refused to admit guilt in the planning of the crime, he did agree that he played a role in aiding Johnson with the disposal of the body. The jury deliberated for over 24 hours. Then, on a Friday afternoon in November, the jury assembled in front of the court and gave a verdict of not guilty. Prosecutors immediately charged Tupa with being an accessory to the crime. For this, Tupa pled guilty and was sentenced 1 to 5 years in Stillwater prison. Johnson would serve a life sentence. The case of Frank Micah's murder was finally over. Both men served their sentence, yet it's unclear as to what happened to them afterwards. It's a likely possibility that Johnson never walked free again. For Micah, his family can now put the horrible killing of their loved one behind them. For McLeod County, people could rest easy knowing the case had been solved. The crime of the century was solved. It wouldn't be until January of 1950, 16 years later, when an unhinged woman murdered a Hutchinson lawyer, that the people of McLeod County would once again find themselves captivated by a horrible crime. So those were our stories for you this month. A little bit of a true crime kind of theme going on. That last story, the one about Frank Micah, that one really kind of strikes a chord with me. Like I said, there's a little bit of a surprise ending there, finding out that Elper Tupa was actually in on the murder. And although he comes out and says that he didn't have any part, in the planning of the murder, I just don't know if I buy that. I think he got off by only having the 1 to 5 year sentencing for being an accomplice to, hiding the evidence. But when it comes to the actual murder, it's like, I don't know, for some reason I believe that Johnson kid or guy who said that they planned it together. Just for the fact that Tupa is the first person he went to after the crime went down, and if Tupa had nothing to do with it, then it really wouldn't benefit him at all to hide any of the evidence. So I guess just the math there just doesn't make sense to me. But at any rate, it's a great story. There certainly have been some great true crime stories, in the history in this area. Maybe that's not such a good thing, but if nothing else, it makes for some interesting history. So other than that, I guess that's our show here for this month. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you again next month. Thanks, everybody. Bye.